It is with a sense of urgency that this committee is holding this hearing in the hope that with the help of our witnesses, we can shed light on the problems associated with China's foreign exchange rate policy and consider possible solutions. What seems undisputed on this much disputed issue is that China has a persistent economic strategy, a policy, a key to which is the pegging of its currency to the dollar at an undervalued rate. Since the mid-1990s, China has clearly pursued an export-led growth strategy, focusing on addressing its needs, namely creating jobs and accumulating vast foreign reserves. Central to this export-led growth strategy is China's policy of keeping its currency substantially undervalued. That policy keeps China's exports cheap in the U.S. market and makes imports into China substantially more expensive. China has combined its cheap currency policy with other policies, including most notably government-directed investments in its manufacturing sector, which in turn creates pressures to keep its currency artificially low in order to get rid of excess production by exporting. Chinese leaders have argued that these policies are necessary for its development, for its massive needs to create jobs, although in recent years more and more economists are questioning that proposition. While China has had a clear economic policy, a clear strategy, the U.S., on the other hand, has not. Why not? One reason is that, like so many other trade issues, it gets caught up in the polarization that grips trade issues. Free trade, in quotes, versus protectionism, in quotes. A grip that I have believed harmful and reject. An illustration of the futility of the polarization is China's argument that any action by the U.S. against China's policies of control of its currency would be, in quotes, protectionism, or would lead to, as stated recently, in quotes, a trade war. The easy polarization has helped handicap agreement on whether there is a problem. Increasingly, economists of various bents and other observers reject this. As Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator for the Financial Times, has stated, and I quote, "The policy of keeping the exchange rate down is equivalent to an export subsidy and tariff at a uniform rate." Last week, the New York Times editorial board, another somewhat conservative or cautious commentator on these economic issues, wrote, and I quote, "China's decision to base its economic growth on exporting deliberately undervalued goods is threatening economies around the world. It is fueling huge trade deficits in the U.S. and Europe. Even worse, it is crowding out exports from other developing countries, threatening their hopes of recovery." And these comments are echoed in our trade deficit with China, which for the past 3 years has been over $220 billion annually and is a central driver in our overall trade deficit. Some deny that it has serious consequences for American working families, but the alarm grows that it does indeed. One economist, Paul Krugman, estimates that China's exchange rate reduces U.S. employment by 1.5 million jobs at a time the U.S. faces a crisis of unemployment. China's currency policy and export-led growth policy are bad for the rest of the world, and I quote in here a recent statement by the Financial Times, and we can read it as I distribute the statement. To the extent, while some disagree with the impact of China's policies, and others view the issue through a lens that says hands-off is the answer to market disequilibrium, and that it's best to let things resolve themselves, I think the status quo is not sustainable. The U.S.-China relationship is a vital one for both countries. We are increasingly interdependent, and there are vital policy considerations in addition to economic ones. But the China currency issue itself will not go away. There is no easy answer to the problem, as is true with other important problems, but the answer is not to deny there is a problem. It's been difficult, and we know this, to make progress bilaterally. At times, talk has seemed to produce some progress, but that progress then disappears. Some then have suggested unilateral action, addressing China's currency manipulation under U.S. countervailing and anti-dumping trade remedy laws. Others have proposed the imposition of an additional duty on all imports from China. In 2 weeks, the Obama administration faces again, as past administrations have, an April 15th deadline to decide whether to label China a currency manipulator in the Department of Treasury's semi-annual report. The report requirements may well increase discussions about the use of multilateral fora to address the currency issue. The IMF is the most logical place for these discussions. However, to date, the institution has been unable to act effectively. Thus, some have suggested using multilateral negotiations through the G20 to address the problem. And some have urged the U.S. to bring a case in the WTO. But the WTO articles relating to currency have never been tested. So here we are. Here we are. And we're fortunate today to have with us 4 experts on China's exchange rate policy. And they will discuss the extent of the problem and alternative responses to address the problem. And I'll just mention who you are, and then Mr. Camp, you'll take over, and then starting with Dr. Ferguson, they'll testify. Neil Ferguson is a professor of history at Harvard University and of the business administration at the Harvard Business School. Fred Bergston, a veteran of this room, is director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Another frequent visitor, Clyde Prestowitz, president of the Economic Strategy Institute, and Philip Levy, who is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We welcome all 4 of you experts, and you'll start as soon as my friend, Mr. Camp, gives his opening statement.